This is video 6-3 and it's FIFO time. You might be scared, but FIFO don't care. FIFO takes what it wants because it's hungry. So we're going to jump into the FIFO examples. They're going to go similar to the weighted average with a few exceptions. All right, now to calculate FIFO rates, remember we had to back out beginning WIP equivalent units to create the total equivalent units denominator for FIFO. We did that because we're not going to include beginning WIP costs in the numerator. And so we want the equivalent units that represent those costs to be out of the denominator as well. We already covered that. We covered the fact that you take right here, you take the beginning WIP equivalent units and subtract them away from the completed units because you don't want those equivalent units hanging around. They're not going to be part of our allocation. Those beginning units costs are going to go directly to units completed and transferred out. They were the first in at the beginning of the period, and therefore they're the first out. And so our rate is only going to be taking current period costs and allocating those between ending WIP and completed and transferred out. And so you don't want the rate to include the equivalent units that represent last period's work because we're not going to have last period's work the cost for last period work in the numerator either. We just have the numerator as this blue, and it's going to be going to the units that were completed transferred out from this period and the ending WIP units. This part actually, this part right here is very similar to what we did before in weighted average. So it's this part right here that gets a little different. You calculate the rate a little differently, and then this particular allocation. This part right here requires a stronger understanding of why you're doing what you're doing with FIFO. Otherwise, you'll get a couple of steps wrong. All right, so the rate. We have the numerator, which is just current period costs, and we have the denominator, which is total equivalent units as we calculated them with FIFO. So here we have our total equivalent units, 20,000. Our ending WIP units with respect to, this is all a conversion cost rate we're trying to calculate. We're trying to use the same numbers as weighted average, and up here we were calculating the, right here. We were trying to do a conversion cost per equivalent unit calculation right here. So we have those same numbers with a little bit of added information or a little bit of added calculation we have to do. We have, again, 20,000 units we completed this period. 500 units in ending WIP, which are 40% complete with respect to conversion cost, which is the only percent completion we care about because we're doing the conversion cost rate right now. This part becomes important here in FIFO, whereas it was not important at all. We ignored it in the weighted average calculation. We care, though, that the beginning WIP units are 600 and they're 60% complete with respect to conversion costs because that's going to lead to the equivalent units in the beginning WIP because we subtract those out from our denominator. We have a beginning balance of conversion for conversion costs of $15,000. That is to say, of our beginning WIP balance, $15,000 of that is from conversion costs. And that doesn't matter for the rate calculation. We're going to ignore that number right here. We need it later. So what I tell students oftentimes is I want you to keep this number and send it into orbit. So it'll be out in orbit for a while, and then later after you've calculated the rate, it'll come back. That's when you need it later. But just put a little pin in this one. Put it on the wall, put it in orbit, it'll come back later. Right now we're just focusing on this number right here. This is the numerator, and we're going to take these three numbers to get the denominator. So the denominator is calculated right here, or if you care for it, right down here. You have our 20,000 equivalent units that were completed, or that's the actual units, the physical units completed, the same thing. When they're completed, they're 100% complete, so the equivalent units is equal to the physical units. The ending WIP units are 500 physical units times their percent completion of 40% gives us 200 equivalent units in ending WIP. Our beginning WIP units, we care about this because we're going to have to subtract away the beginning WIP equivalent units from the 20,000 units completed. Some of those units completed, some of the equivalent units completed are us just topping off the beginning WIP units. We had 600 units that were most of the way done, 3/5 of the way done. And we have to do then 2/5 of the work to finish them. So we need to not include the 3/5 that we did last period in our equivalent units. We're going to subtract that away from this number right here. That 20,000 includes 600 units that we did only 2/5 of the work on. So we need to factor that in for FIFO. Otherwise, our denominator is implicitly saying that we should be including the cost of that work from last period. We're not going to in FIFO. So we want the denominator to accurately omit last period's work. Okay, so we have the 600 times 60% gives us 360 as the beginning WIP equivalent units. So we have 20,000 plus 200 minus 360 gives us 19,840. That's our denominator, our TEU under FIFO for conversion cost given this fact pattern. Nice and simple. Current period costs with respect to conversion costs is $300,000. That's the numerator. Take those two and you get $15.12. That's our conversion cost per equivalent unit. Great. Hey, that's great. It doesn't necessarily have to be lower than our rate we calculated for a weighted average, which was $15.59. Because there were beginning WIP units, this total equivalent units number is going to be lower than in our weighted average example. But the rate can be whatever it is. Let's say, for example, if we had a really bad cost period this period, we would not have 300,000. We might have 400,000. And if we divided 400,000 by 15 or 1984, we would get a significantly different number. I think we'd be over $20. So we could have a worse rate based on current period costs under FIFO a worse rate under FIFO than under weighted average. All right, so if you're using FIFO now, let's talk about first the ending WIP calculations first, the cost that we're going to push over towards ending WIP. It's going to be the same procedure. We won't get the same numbers, but it's going to be the same procedure that we had under weighted average. Our allocation step is the same thing when we're talking about the ending WIP. We have a rate. We're multiplying by the equivalent units in ending WIP to get our cost for that cost category, the cost going to ending WIP. So we have our conversion cost rate of $15.12 times the equivalent units with respect to conversion costs gives us our conversion cost ending WIP cost. We have a rate for direct materials, $19.50, multiplied by 500 equivalent units in ending WIP. That gives us our ending WIP direct materials cost of $9,750. We have a transferred in cost for equivalent units of $13 multiplied by the equivalent units with respect to transferred in costs in ending WIP, of course, and then when we multiply that, we get $6,500 is our total transferred in cost in ending WIP. You sum these three together, you get $19,274.19. That's our total ending WIP cost. The procedure was the same as we had up here under weighted average. We were just multiplying rate by equivalent units and get the total cost for that cost category. We do that for each cost category, and then the sum is our total ending WIP cost. Of course, like I said in the last video, for weighted average, of course, each of these numbers is going to be kept separate somewhere in the system, some way of being able to tease those numbers out next period because you're going to need them for the beginning WIP calculation. Now, in FIFO, you technically don't need to do that because this number right here is not going to be used for next period's calculation. We technically don't need to know the beginning WIP cost that's due to conversion costs. Ending WIP this period, beginning WIP next period. We don't need to know next period's beginning WIP costs that are due to conversion costs for the system to work. You might still want to keep track of it for responsibility accounting purposes or for management control purposes, but you don't technically need to do that. All right, now let's talk about what happens here on the right side of this screenshot of this figure here. It looks similar with an extra step. We have a rate here, we have units completed, we have a cost number, and then we're adding in an extra cost to get a new cost number. So let's take that step by step. We have a rate. It's the same as over here, same rate. We have units completed. Now this is modified. This is a modified units completed number from what we had before. Under weighted average, we just took our units completed that we saw on the calculation. We said, we have 20,000 units completed, so then those are the units that we need to multiply our rate by to get the amount of cost in that cost category that go over to the credit side of the department WIP account. Not so here, because what we're actually doing is we want to know the units completed backing out the beginning WIP equivalent unit. So we're going to take our units completed and subtract away this right here. It's just what's in the brackets right here. That's why I set this up a long time ago, way back up here when I talked about the FIFO equation. I said here are the three terms, and you could rearrange it to look like this because we need this figure inside these brackets. We're going to need that for our calculation down here for applying costs. We need our rate times the work we did this period on units completed. in equivalent units. Because we finished, in total, we finished 20,000 units, sure. But there were the equivalent of 360 units worth that was actually from last period. Under FIFO, we're sticklers about this. This period's costs for this period's work, last period's costs for last period's work. So we have this amount of work that we did for this period, 19,640. We had 19,400 units. We have 20,000 units completed minus our 600 beginning WIP units. 19,400 units that we started and completed this period. And then for these 600 units, we did 40% of the extra work to top them off. They were 60% complete at the beginning of this period. We did 40% of the work to top them off, which equals 240. So we have 19,400 plus 240. So that's the additive way of getting to 19,640, this modify units completed number that you need. What work did we do this period? Well, we did our units started and completed, and then we also did work to top off the beginning WIP units. So we only care about the work this period because we're using this period's rate. FIFO's very picky about this. This is this period's rate. It only had this period's costs in the numerator. So it's this period's rate. We only need to multiply it and apply it to units completed, the work done this period. So we did 200 equivalent units worth of work for ending WIP. We did 19,640 units worth of work this period. Alternatively, I've been explaining it from the beginning more of the subtractive mode. So we have two ways of getting to this number. You can either add up and say, well, we started and completed 19,400 units. That's this total units that we completed minus the physical units that we started with. We have 600 units that we started with. So that must mean that we started and completed 19,400 units this period. That's additive. Or you could subtract away. You could say, we completed 20,000, but there were the equivalent of 360 units worth of work that we did last period. So we can't include that. We got to subtract that away. So 20,000 minus this 360 gets us this 19,640 units completed. So that's this period's units completed. The work done this period for the units that were completed. And that gives us this rate times that modified units completed number for this period's work. That gives us this period's total cost with respect to conversion costs. This units completed is specific to conversion costs because that's percent complete is specific to conversion costs. And the rate is specific to conversion costs. Now, I told you earlier, you take this number and you send it into orbit because it's going to come back around later and it's going to play a role. It does. Yes, we don't take this period's rate and apply it to last period's work, the beginning WIP, the 360 equivalent units in beginning WIP that we did work on last period. But we're going to take just that raw number and dump it in because they were the first units in, that 360 equivalent units of work done last period. That's 600 times 60%, 360. We have a cost for those equivalent units of $15,000. And so those are the first units in, first units out. First in costs, first out costs. So we're just going to add that in, just raw. Just comes in, gets added in. So we have this period's work plus last period's work right there. And then we have our total unit completed cost with respect to conversion costs. We do that again here with direct materials. We have our direct materials rate. We have our units completed, which is 19,000 minus 600 because in this example, we're saying that direct materials are 100% complete for this beginning WIP units. So this they're 600 times 100% equals 600 equivalent units. So 20,000 minus 600 equals 19,400. So this period's rate, this period's work. We did no work with respect to direct materials on those beginning WIP units, 600 beginning WIP units. That gives us this period's application of cost. Plus, we just are keeping those 600 units. They get to keep their cost, $32,200 worth. We send it into orbit at the beginning of the process. Now it's come all the way back. We add these two together. We get $410,500. That's our direct materials cost for units completed. Same procedure with transferred in costs. We have our rate. We have our units completed. That gives us this period's transferred in costs with this period's work. Then we add in our beginning WIP transferred in costs at the very end of this calculation. Now we have our total costs for transferred in, with respect to transferred in costs for our units completed. Now we take this bottom line number for each of these three categories, add them together, and we have our total cost for units completed. So let's summarize here for a minute. We have FIFO, and it takes the costs from the current period. It is very careful about only taking those costs and dividing them up into ending WIP, and those costs that were completed and transferred out. They're going to be credited to our department's WIP account and then debited over to a different the downstream department's WIP account or to finished goods. And at the same time, keeping the relationship between those beginning WIP units, their equivalent units, whatever completeness we had from them in the last period, and the cost that we incurred last period. So those are going to be the first costs to go to units completed. And so as a result of that, we have to be very careful with what we're multiplying when we do this arrow right here. That's where I see so many people get tripped up. Or they forget to do the black arrow right here. They forget to send these costs into orbit, let them come back and end up right in units completed and transferred out. So we have a numerator that's just current period costs, and we have a denominator that backs out our beginning WIP equivalent units, or here or here. Just same equation, just rearranged a little bit. And that's the story for FIFO. A little extra step, a little bit different way of looking at it. Hopefully the logic of it makes sense. I think if you're not 100% sure that it makes sense to you, maybe it'd be good to run through some examples, look at the examples that I have again. For example, the big table that I presented here is a weighted average example, and here is the FIFO example. And think through how the rates represent what's being done with the costs, and how they represent a segregation between current period costs and work and last period's costs and work, which is essential if, like under FIFO, like I said in video 6-1, FIFO, we are going to go ahead and keep the period separate. We don't want this period's work blending into next period and the next period and the next period. Each period needs to have its work be as segmented as possible, and so FIFO says no. Last period's work at most is going to affect this period's downstream accounts, because we're just going to take those costs and move them directly to costs completed and transferred, or costs of the units completed and transferred out. Whereas weighted average, we take those costs and some of those end up in ending WIP, which becomes next period's beginning WIP, and then that moves some of those move into ending WIP, and so little by little they filter out tiny bit by tiny bit. And that's it for chapter 6. Bye.